Hey, what's going on, guys? Aarava here, and welcome back to a brand new video today. And well, this one is a very, very different one, as you can clearly tell by the title of the video. This is going to be probably a very slow, kind of longer video, and a bit of a rambly video, to be honest. As you can see, it's going to be about my university dissertation. It's a video I've been meaning to make for about a month or more, and I just haven't, I tried two different attempts. The first attempt, the camera died. The second attempt, the video just didn't come out as I was hoping it to. In the end now, it's been so delayed that I just want to do it, and, whatever this video turns out to be is the video. It's going to be probably more interesting for any actual engineering students, or maybe those of you who are just interested in the technology and nerdier side of Formula One. So if you're just here for the gaming stuff, then I don't know if you'll exactly enjoy the video. So I'm just putting that out there. But obviously by now you would have probably clicked off if you're not interested in it. So yeah, if you didn't know, earlier this year, in June, in fact, I finished off my exams, literally at the beginning of June, and later in the summer, I graduated with an aerospace engineering degree, and part of that engineering degree involved well, I'm going to say dissertation, just because most people probably know what that means from the UK. I guess if you're from other countries, maybe they call it a thesis, or, just... I mean, for me, officially it was called just a third year project, because in engineering it wasn't exactly just like a hypothesis and then you write an entire essay. It was basically a report on a bit of well, for me, in my case it was CFD simulation, but others did experiments. Some people made stuff for their third year project, but obviously I think most people know what I'm talking about when I say dissertation, because in other subjects like English and whatever, you call it a dissertation. So I'm just going to continue to reference it like that, but obviously it's not exactly a dissertation. It's just a big fancy lab report, basically. But yeah, for my third year project, I did it on Formula One. So I thought it'd be interesting enough for people to maybe take interest in, especially, as I said, any fellow engineering, well, I was going to say fellow engineering students, but I'm not a student anymore, but you get what I mean. Hopefully this will be somewhat interesting to those guys, and even, people in A-level or GCSE, if you're kind of considering engineering. Hopefully, this video maybe gives you an insight into what you could get up to in an aerospace engineering degree. To that extent, I don't really know what I'm aiming to achieve with this video exactly. I know that for sure there was some interest on Twitter when I was tweeting about it, but I just don't know what exactly. I'm hoping to inform, those of you who are in A level or whatever like that, to give you that kind of idea. Maybe if you're already in doing an engineering degree in like lower years, in first or second year, maybe it's gonna, I don't know, give you an idea of what maybe you could look into for a third year project, or I don't know really. But also at the same time, I just felt like sharing it as well, because it is a very different side of my life that obviously I haven't ever shared on YouTube with the gaming videos and whatever. The closest thing to kind of sharing this side of my life is pretty much when I do the aerodynamics videos for the new F1 season. And I know this question is going to come up for a lot of people straight away, so I'm just going to get out of the way before we actually dive into the actual report itself. In terms of what I got overall for the report itself, for the entire third year project, including the literature review, this report, presentations I have to do, a few others like submitted pieces of work. Overall, I scored 81% on it, which I was absolutely chuffed with. It was a long slog for this final year, as you would have seen also on the channel if you were keeping up with the channel. I was uploading still at least 2 to 3 videos a week pretty much in the final year of my degree, which didn't make any sense. I think I uploaded more videos in the final year of my degree than I did in the first year of my degree, which it's still to this day, I personally don't even know how I managed, but I managed it. And to come out with a score like that, which is a very, very strong first, obviously. If you're unfamiliar with the UK grading system in universities, basically 70% and above is first, where it's called the first grade, which is the highest grade you can achieve, and then 10% down from that, 60 to 70 is 2-1, and then 2-2 is 50 to 60, and then you get my drift. Anything lower than that, blah blah blah. So yeah, really solid first on the actual entire project itself. And then overall, I know that'll also be another question, what did I get overall in degree? I ended up with a pretty solid 2-1 coming out of it, which again I'm really chuffed about. You'll know if you do engineering at university, it's a very demanding degree. It's a very busy, time-consuming one. Specifically as well, I found aerospace engineering was pretty damn demanding, and to come out with a 2-1 and having done YouTube the entire time, I really can't complain one bit, and I'm actually really, really happy with that. And obviously, at the end of the day, as you would have noticed, since June, I've been going absolutely, hammer time on YouTube, and I can still sit here and have the degree as a nice backup plan. Not many people can say they have a degree like this as a backup plan. So yeah, I mean, let's just get into it anyway. That's the end of that situation. So let's get into actually looking at this. So we're going to start off with the abstract, I guess. Obviously, I kind of briefly mentioned the entire third-year project was this final report, but there was also a literature review which was separate from this report. So if you kind of scroll through, it's the abstract, then I've got like acknowledgements, then I've got my entire list of contents, list of figures, whatever, introduction, aims and objectives, and then I've got a literature review here. But this literature review is a lot smaller. Like, this is literally, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6. Well, 5 pages of writing, and then like a 6th page for a picture. So 5 pages. It's a lot more condensed. The actual full literature review ended up being like 14 pages, which is like its separate document I had to hand in. Like, I think it was last year, 2016, in November. So it was a very early hand in for the literature review to be separate, and then this was handed in April 2017, which was an awesome month. It was a big relief to hand it in, like print it off, 2 copies printed off, hand it in, like, there you go, bish bash bosh, the entire year kind of basically dusted off, apart from the exams, obviously. But so the abstract just kind of setting out what the kind of project was going to entail. So I said it was on Formula One. It didn't really actually specify what it was about. So basically, my project was on the 2017 aerodynamic regulations. I wanted to compare the 2017 regulations to the 2016 one, because of course there was a lot of debate before this season kicked off, way back, in January 2017, even in 2016, about the dirty air that this would kind of cause. The new aero, it's going to be a nightmare for cars to follow, and to an extent, at some tracks it has been apparent, especially in the first race it was very apparent, but it's kind of leveled out and it's kind of been okay in terms of dirty air. But I wanted to kind of compare that and see what was going on. Initially I wanted to look at the entire car, but then my supervisor, who was assigned to me for the entire year, basically said that was way too ambitious for a third-year degree, so he suggested that I just look at kind of one part of the car. So I kind of looked around, thought about maybe the rear end, maybe the side pod areas. In the end, I went for the front end, because it was obviously the front end of these F1 cars now are so complex, so important for the rest of the car. Anything that happens at the front goes towards the back. So I thought I would look at the front end and basically look at the interaction between the front wing and the tyres, because that's another thing for this year. Obviously, the tyres got wider, so I was curious to see, is that going to change how the flow works? Because if the tyre's wider, that's just more tyre to get for the air to get around. So I was curious if that's going to really affect things dramatically. So basically, I was going to compare the flow patterns, see what the differences were, and basically it was a kind of an odd conclusion. There was no kind of right-wrong conclusion here. The conclusion was basically just presenting the difference in the flow patterns, and that was pretty much it. And then maybe from that, trying to maybe kind of give an opinion on whether it's going to affect racing or not. And then a lot of it, obviously, for third-year projects, at least at my university, there was a big emphasis on also future work. So a lot of the time with engineering and also just any science subject, generally every dissertation you'll do, and even scientific journals and papers you'll find in the public domain, every single one is basically building upon previous work from what someone else has done. It's like, okay, so this guy did this base work, so I'm going to go a little bit step further and go a little bit more in depth. So towards the end of the project, I also gave kind of future suggestions of work. So that was kind of how everything wrapped up. So introduction, just introducing the rules. I basically go through, because although my supervisor kind of knew what I was doing, there would also be a second person reading this who would be like another lecturer who perhaps didn't know anything about F1 or, a race car aerodynamics as such, because obviously that's another thing in itself. I was doing this on F1, and pretty much all the physics you learn in aerospace engineering is just to do with planes. Like, no one really ever mentions race cars unless you're doing like a motorsports degree, but I did aerospace, the broader topic, so it was all about airplanes. So I had to kind of also explain everything in F1 terms, in like race car terms. So introducing the kind of new rules, kind of specifically touting out what the specific widths would be of the car. Saying there's a lack of research on modern F1 cars, because there definitely is. There's just not a lot of research in terms of concrete journals about modern F1 cars. There's plenty about older spec F1 cars, like single element, like literally plank of wood wings, but there's not a lot about the new kind of rocket ship cars we have for the last, 10 years or so. So aims and objectives, just setting out what I wanted to do. As I mentioned, comparing flow vorticity plots to gain an understanding of the flow behavior and the different problems each geometry faced. The geometries were a generic 2016 car and a generic 2017 car. Those I purchased off a CAD website, basically, and it was designed by the same guy, and giving him credit in the acknowledgement, and it was under fair use in terms of I'm using it for educational purposes. So yeah, having the same designer make generic models for 2016, 2017 gave me the best kind of crossover of, okay, there's not too much outside, design difference. It's the same designer, so in theory he should be designing it the same sort of way, so it was the best way to work in that aspect. So generic geometries there. So I think they're based off very, you'll see actually if I scroll down, they're based off very heavily on the FIA official videos that they gave. So this was the FIA official video. They did a video about changing 2016 to 2017. And when I looked at it, it seems like the designer really based it basically off that video, essentially. You can see that's the geometry opened up in, I think it was Creo, this is. Actually, no, it's opened up in StarCCM, my bad. If you don't know what that is, StarCCM is basically the CFD software I used. It was the one available in my university. It's the one they have like a mega kind of cluster computer hooked up to StarCCM, so that's why I chose that program compared to maybe other programs you might see other kind of unis use or any other kind of papers. But yeah, you can clearly see that the designer kind of basically used that video as a basis, so it actually worked out really well in terms of it was the closest thing I could get to what the official F1 guys used to demonstrate a 2016 and 2017 car, so it works out. So yeah, the introduction was just kind of saying that, aims and objectives, as I was actually saying. So flow vorticity, basically the plots, kind of seeing where the air is swirling around, comparing the pressure coefficient maps over the two geometries to help explain certain aspects of the vortex. So the pressure across the geometries can basically help explain and kind of back up what we're seeing for the flow vortexes. So obviously the pressure is governing whatever happens there, the physics of it. So that can help kind of go in tandem with the vortex flow charts to kind of help explain that. And then these last 3 points are basically what I was mentioning about the conclusion. From analysis and comparison, make suggestions on future work and areas to consider to help further understanding of this area of aerodynamics, and then produce report results from simulations to show the coefficient of lift and drag. So this was like the smaller one. That's why it's like the fourth point. Basically, just a few numbers to kind of compare coefficient of lift and drag. That was less important because the numbers won't matter too much because obviously it's a third year report. It's as I said, two generic geometries. The numbers aren't going to be entirely accurate, whereas the actual pattern of the flow in the simulation may be pretty accurate, so that's why that's kind of a smaller fourth point. So we go into the literature review. As I said, there is a bigger one that I did. Right, so we're getting into the kind of actual meat of the report, so I'm going to try my best to slow down the talk. I know I can talk quite fast. I'm not going to go into immense detail with everything because really I just don't want the video to be too long and strung out. If you are interested, then you can maybe tweet me if you have certain questions, or pop them in the comments below, and also by the end of the video, just in general for everyone, if you have any questions about it, then pop them in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you, or you can tweet me, as I said, and I can try and tweet you back. But yeah, we get into literature review. So as I said, I have to kind of explain F1 aerodynamics in kind of simpler terms for the lecturers to kind of read through, and to kind of also kind of showcase that I, on a fundamental basis, understand why certain things work for race cars in general. So not even F1, just race cars, why you have certain things. So in terms of the Formula 1 front wing design, I had to kind of go through and explain what flaps are. So by that I mean these kind of little flaps here that are painted in the Red Bull symbols, explain what end plates are and why they have them in race cars and why they're useful and such and such. So as I said, kind of also explaining it for the lecturer who may not know about race car aerodynamics. So kind of I have to explain it in aerospace terms and then flip it on its head for race cars. So like in aerospace terms, flaps serve as a way to induce more lift to keep the flow attached for longer by accelerating it through the little slot gaps. If you have two flaps, basically that little slot gap in between. But then you can see I go into, but in Formula 1, and then blah, blah, blah. I have to kind of explain it in that sense. So in F1, obviously, also these flaps aren't just there to create downforce. They're more so, even more, I think you could argue they're more so there as a flow control device, because we've seen now with the modern wing cars, you have this kind of archway of the wings. Like the Mercedes was kind of the first car that kind of introduced it in 2015. You have this kind of archway where it's kind of funneling air to the outside the tire, and so in that way the flaps aren't even there creating downforce. They're more actually just moving the flow around to where the engineers want it to. Same thing with the end plates. So end plates generally are there to fundamentally concentrate the tip vortexes, kind of take away any turbulent air from the main plane, keep that as smooth as possible, kind of concentrate all that turbulent air to the tip of the vortex, and in doing so they can actually manipulate that tip vortex to strengthen and smoothen out any air coming off the front tires, which you'll see a little bit later. And so as we move through to the second page, just kind of emphasizing that and kind of backing up my points, I actually ended up using a screenshot from a 2013 onboard of Mark Webber. So it was things like this where this project ended up being definitely my favorite part of my entire degree. Like, I'm not going to beat around the bush and pretend like it was all like amazing. A lot of my degree, a lot of the lectures were very, very dry. There was a lot of dry content where it's, you know, standard student stuff. You want to kind of fall asleep during the lecture. You'd rather be somewhere else. But the project, there was so many parts where it was like I'm genuinely really like interested in what's going on, and I'm genuinely happy that I'm doing it, because, you know, being able to use real life 2013 examples of, you know, where you can see here the vortex bouncing from basically the front wing would be somewhere here and bouncing from the barge board to then the side pod area there. Being able to use those examples to actually back up my points of what I've been going on about was really, really satisfying. And so I go through using some technical drawings and basically just explaining the modern F1 wing, because it's very different to what you generally see in textbooks. Whenever you look at race cars and aerodynamics, it's generally always the textbooks just use, like, as I said, one element and one element end plate, and you compare that to the F1 wings we know, it's a completely different kind of universe. So I had to kind of explain that, and then finally kind of just showing the difference between 2016 and 2017. So that was basically F1 wings in general, I had to explain. So I'm going to rattle through this a little bit faster. So we go through front wing changes in terms of just the span of the wing. So obviously the wings got wider in 2017. So I wanted to just look at a very base level what happens when you increase wings on race cars. So looking at that and kind of, you know, showing that, you know, previous research has shown that just in general, if you increase the span, you are going to get more downforce. And then also the vortex itself, though, however, doesn't really change too much. Like you can see going from a shorter span to a longer span, the pattern hasn't changed too much. All that's kind of changed really is this main vortex is kind of elongated a little bit, stretched over. You can see the kind of bleeding off of the vortex on the inside towards this is the kind of middle part of the wing, and this is the end plate. So moving to the inside, you can just see the bleeding off effect is a little bit longer. But apart from that, the actual shape itself is the same. But in terms of the actual data for the negative lift, the downforce you're creating, you are going to just, you would assume anyway that it would create more downforce, and it does, and the research does back that up. So that was the kind of wingspan section. So you can see I've kind of broken it up to just F1 aerodynamics in general, wingspan changes. Then we go on to the actual interactions between wings and wheels. So there's quite a bit of more recent research from like 2012, 2013, 2014 into this kind of interaction points. But again, through the literature review, it's all, you know, you can see it's just a simple wing. Like this is the end plate here, and then it's just the wing, and then it's just the tire. Like, it's very, very simple. But for a literature review, it was good because it kind of just gave you a fundamental understanding and kind of allowed me to show off the fundamental understanding before actually doing my own research and CFD simulations. So looking at the interactions and basically just explaining those, essentially, you can see these are basically the vortex plots that I'll be looking to also reproduce later in this report. And then this is the pressure coefficient plot, which I'll be looking to try and reproduce with my own kind of data. So basically, these kind of two were kind of huge templates for me in terms of what I wanted to kind of present it with. They were a good way to kind of show, okay, I think this is the best way to present my data when I do it, basically. In terms of these simpler wheel-to-wing interactions, the kind of main talking points you can see, concentrated stagnation point at the front of the tire. And so what that enables is a bleed over of pressure, higher pressure onto the actual wing. And what that creates is a higher differential of pressure between the inside of the end plate and the outside of the end plate. You can see here the difference. The darker green and the lighter green is the difference in pressure, and because there's a higher pressure now on the inside compared to the outside, it's going to go, obviously the air will go from high to low pressure, and you can kind of hopefully picture it in 3D terms. You know, high pressure here, low pressure here, the air is going to spiral over the end plate, and that's going to create an even stronger tip vortex going across. So that's what the wheel interaction will actually help the wing in a sense. And then looking at the vorticity plots here, you can see this is the main kind of vortex, and you have this end plate vortex, which is going to get strengthened, and you can see the difference that when you go from this one to this one over here, the combined wing and wheel, compared to the isolated wheel, downstream, you can see the vortex has grown larger. It's a lot more rigid. It's like a lot more circular, a lot more structured. So actually the wheel is helping that vortex, in that case, kind of be structured as it goes downstream towards, you would imagine, going down towards the side pod, basically. And then the inside one gets shed a little bit. You can see it gets warped and kind of stretched from this kind of cleaner inside vortex. So that's also one part that I pointed out of I wanted to look at for my research, basically, that in F1 that's going to get manipulated, just like we mentioned with the Mark Webber picture. That vortex there is going to get manipulated. So the fact that it gets shed a little bit and warped in these simpler kind of cases is a topic of interest. And so that's another thing. Throughout the literature review, whilst you're reviewing the literature, the entire time you're basically going after every sentence. This is why I want to do some research about it, or this is what I'm gonna look at, or this is why it's a point of interest and why I'll be looking at it. So you're basically just justifying why you're doing the work you're going to do, basically. So if you don't have enough justification, basically it's kind of a weaker report, basically, because then it's kind of a way for the lecturer to question, so why did he do this? Like, what was the point of it? So just trying to kind of suss that out. And for me, this topic was very, very good because, as I mentioned, there's basically not that much relevant research into modern F1 aero because it's all very secretive these days, obviously, and I guess a lot of people just aren't very interested in it. I mean, in general, across the entire UK, so there's not a lot of very, very recent modern F1 like scientific journals out there or reports. So the entire time it was very easy to kind of keep on saying, basically, yes, we've got a simpler term, but what's going to happen on the more complex stuff? So then we move on to the simulation methodology. So this was basically just explaining how I was going to go about everything. So as I said, this is the kind of generic geometry. I opened it up into Creo, which is a CAD software, and then I'd basically splice it and cut it up and kind of remove the suspension arms. I would remove the entire rear end. You can see it's just become a bluff body because I'm not interested in that. All I'm interested in pretty much is this front wing to wheel interaction. After the wheel, I pretty much don't care about it because that's out of my jurisdiction. That's not something I'm going to look at because it's just too complicated for one by myself individual project. So just simplifying the geometry in Creo, opening up in StarCCM, which is the CFD software I've used. So in StarCCM and pretty much any CFD software, you create basically a volume control. And the volume control is basically, it's like a virtual wind tunnel, basically. You create an inlet, you create an outlet, you create walls, and you basically do a symmetry wall down the middle, because what you do actually to save computational time, because these CFD simulations take a lot of number crunching. Like, you have to actually have a very good PC for it. And actually, in the end, what was the funny thing was, I did most of my simulations on this PC that I'm running this video on my gaming PC, the one I use to game on, the one I use to do video editing on. I did most of my simulations on this PC because it's a 6-core i7 processor, 32 gigabytes of RAM. So compared to your average student, the PC is very, very decent. So compared to other fellow students that were also doing CFD projects, they had to keep on going into university and using our university's, it was like what's it called? HPC cluster. So basically it's like a supercomputer that you basically log in, you send off your kind of job in kind of code, and you send it off to the cluster server, and the cluster server does the work for you. It's a supercomputer that will turn it around in a few hours and send it back to you, but you had to be there on site at uni to basically access it most of the time reliably. So I tried to actually use that, but in the end it was so fiddly, because you basically had to log in into like a Linux profile and then send it in, and it was just such a faff, and it was such a waste of time. And obviously for me, doing YouTube at the same time, I could not waste any bit of time. Like, I had to travel to uni. It would take an hour, so I was not about that life. I was not going to travel an hour to uni just to submit a job that would then sit for a few hours and come back to me, and then I would travel back an hour. So I actually did most of my simulations on my gaming PC. So who knew? Having a gaming PC and doing YouTube actually came in handy for the simulations, because I ended up running it most on my PC. It would take about like 8 hours maybe on my PC, which is not too bad. Like, I'll set it off and then I'll just go relax, basically. But yeah, so to save computational power, that was the point I was on. To save computational power, you do half the car and basically have a symmetrical line. So the line of symmetry is down the entire half of the car. So like, that's the nose. And so you do a symmetry line down the middle through the entire car. To save computational power, because then you can just, in StarCCM, you can actually just flip the results and basically mirror them, and so you've got a whole car worth of results, but you've only done half the work. So that's a good way to set up the volume control. You got the direction of flow, rolling road simulation as well. So in terms of the actual, actually here this is quite useful. So in terms of the car surface, I set that up as a wall. Obviously, inlet boundary. So the inlet is a velocity inlet. The outlet is a flow split outlet. The symmetry is the symmetry plane there. Then you've got the ceiling and the opposite wall, and those have a slip condition. So effectively, that means the air is not going to get actually affected. It's not a boundary layer being created at that wall. So it's as if the wall is not there, but it is there, because obviously we need to save computational power. We can't just say, okay, simulate everything, the infinite air, so you have that volume control there, but you set it as a slip condition so it doesn't get affected. And then the floor is a wall like the car surface with a boundary layer, but also at the same time we have the same velocity as the incoming flow to simulate a rolling road, because obviously I don't want to simulate the car static, I need to simulate it moving. So in that case, what I do is, instead of having the car move, I have the wall move, because that's the same thing with the simulation and in pretty much the entirety of engineering. The entire time you always look at the object's static, and you always just look at the air moving towards the object. So just like with the air, the inlet, the air is moving towards the car, you have the road moving this way. And the same thing with the tires. The tires I would set up basically in the geometry. I could just pinpoint the individual tire, and I would tell the software to basically say, okay, I want the tire rotating backwards like this to simulate the tire moving across, obviously, as it's driving, basically. And that would also be at the same velocity as the air and the road. So it wasn't as simple as just buying the geometry and then opening up in Creo, simplifying it, and then putting it into StarCCM, and that was it. But, like, it just worked like magic. There was many countless hours of repairing this bloody geometry, adapting it, and then surface wrapping it. So basically, to try and get it as smooth as possible. So the guy who designed it, obviously, he's done a fabulous job designing it, but at the end of the day, it wasn't completely airtight as the simulation needed, and the more airtight and kind of just without errors you can get the geometry, the better for the simulation. And then eventually you surface wrap it and surface mesh it. So the best way I can explain it is like, if you've ever seen vacuum packing, if you vacuum pack something, like, you have the kind of the warm acrylic, and you kind of stamp up the object like that, and you vacuum seal it and vacuum pack it like that, and it creates a shape. That's basically what you're doing with this. You're basically surface wrapping the entire car and creating a surface mesh from the geometry, and then on the surface mesh is where you're actually then creating the volume mesh, which is the entire 3D mesh that the simulation uses. So this was actually a large part of the project. I would say, like, over the entire year, the work I was doing, I think about 60% maybe, or even 50 at least, percent of the work was just getting the meshing and the numerical model all, like, fine and all how I wanted it. Especially the mesh had to be as good as possible. So the better mesh you have, the more accurate of a mesh you have, the more accurate results you're going to have. Obviously, there is limitations. It's a student third-year project, so in reality, that's something that I brought up in the end of the conclusion as well, which is another big thing about these engineering reports. The entire time, you just also talk about errors and basically how you can improve it. The entire time, it was a case of, yeah, this is to a certain point this accurate. I would like to, in hindsight, get it more accurate, but I don't have enough time. This is a third-year project, so I have to kind of just accept the results as they are like this. I have to accept the mesh like this. So in the end, in terms of my numerical model, I ended up using a K epsilon 2-order equation. So this is using the 3D Navier-Stokes equation, which if you're in first year, I think you should come across. Definitely by second year of aerospace engineering, at least, you would have come across by now, at least I did in second year, and even in first year a little bit, the Reynolds equation, the Navier-Stokes equations, basically just all the governing equations for flow in 3D and air moving in 3D. I think in first year there was like introductions to it in like fluids, in fluids lectures, but basically, yeah. So in the CFD software, you kind of just tick the different boxes for, okay, I want to use Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equation modeling, so that averages all the equations across short amount of times, basically, and then the 3D version of it, obviously, because we're not looking at it in a 2D sense, we're looking at a 3D space, and then the actual turbulence model itself is a K epsilon 2-order equation. Obviously, you need a turbulence equation, because this is not a smooth flow, it's a turbulent flow. So there are other turbulence models that my supervisors was suggesting. In the end, having looked at all my literature review stuff as well, I went with the K epsilon model because a lot of the more recent papers all use the K epsilon model, and it seemed to be the most accurate and the least fiddly as well, and also saved computational time as well, because it ended up being a good compromise between a steady solution and also the time it saved for computation. Specifically, I was also using something called the realizable K epsilon model variant, so that was chosen to alter constants to obtain a solution where the normal variant could not. So when the software and the model, the normal one, can't figure out a solution for, like, let's say a certain point on the mesh, it'll basically alter some of the constants and change some of the actual governing kind of constants of the physics around to obtain a result. So it's like padding. It smooths it out. So like instead of having very jaggedy kind of result, it kind of tries to pad it out and smooth it out. Basically, it's a form of bodging a little bit, but it's like a good way to kind of smoothing out results when you know you don't have a perfect mesh, and that definitely was the case with my mesh. It wasn't airtight perfect mesh, so it was needed in that sense. And the goal with meshing and picking your model and everything like that is to get something called mesh convergence. Mesh convergence is essentially kind of the best kind of basic way I could explain it is you need to get to the point where your mesh is accurate enough where if you were to increase the detail of the mesh and increase the complexity, the actual general shape of your simulation data would not change that much. Like it's not changing drastically. And when you get to a point of mesh convergence, you can actually start to simplify your mesh to the lowest denominator point, basically, to save computational power. Ideally, also, hand in hand with mesh convergence goes comparing it to real-life data. So, you know, F1 teams, that's why they have these error rakes, and they'll do error tests on the track, because that also will help them realize if their CFD simulations are accurate. So, especially in pre-season testing, they'll do a lot of, basically, judging if their CFD simulations have worked out as they thought it would. In this case, obviously, I do not have a real-world example. I just have these two computer-designed geometries. So I had to just kind of take mesh convergence on a case of, okay, are the physics changing a lot? And that's something I included all the way in my kind of like appendix, basically, because it wasn't an important part. It's not crucial. It's good to show in the report, but it wasn't crucial to show. But basically just showing that if I increase the number of cells in my mesh, you can see generally the pattern has not changed. Like you can see, yes, some contour lines of the pressure have changed, but generally going from 14.4 million cells to 22 million hasn't changed a lot in terms of the overall shape of what's happening there. So that suggests there is some, it's tending towards mesh convergence. And also using things like StarCCM's own tools to kind of analyze your mesh, and StarCCM, at least, I can't say for other programs, but StarCCM will give you indications of your mesh validity and phase validity and the volume change, and basically if you're within certain bands of percentages, you can basically say, okay, that mesh is good. So final thing on the mesh was also the Y plus value. So Y plus is to do with the wall function, and so it's part of the wall function equation. Between 30 to 300 Y plus, there's a log layer where y plus equals u plus, which is the non-dimensional velocity. So I needed to try and get it in that kind of region for it to basically be a valid simulation. So that was also another part of the refinement, was basically looking at the y plus distribution. Eventually, I got it down to a very reasonable range. You can see here it goes 0 to 300, and you can see it's clearly within that region. Because of the way the geometry is made, there are a few areas where it does spike up from the usual 0 to even like 60 region. And then obviously at stagnation points, naturally y plus is going to be very, very low at those points, because those are stagnation points. There's no kind of air really moving at those points. But if I again move to the appendix, you can see the progression of y plus. Of basically, I started off with this. You can see very, very bad y plus. It's well over 300 into like the 700 region, and then refining it more, getting it further down to around, you can see now it's getting to about 480 most of it. There are a few areas where it goes over to maybe 720, and then eventually I was able to get it to, that really, really nice region where it's all nice and blue. So that's pretty much it. Little kind of caveats of just, looking at the physics conditions. Another kind of cool point, I was able to actually use a real-life example of one of Sebastian Vettel's average speed at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in 2015 was like 54.1 miles per second. So that's how I determined to use 50 miles to the second for the actual speed of the air moving in, and how much the tire was rotating and the road was rotating. And then just little things like converting the wheel to rads per second, and then mesh refinements finished, and then we get onto the result. So that's, as you can clearly see, I probably went on for quite a bit there about that, but that was actually quite a huge part of the project. Like, I was still refining this mesh up until, I want to say, I think it was end of February. And put it in context, obviously the uni year starts in September. I hand in the report in April. So the refinement and the mesh was going on all the way till then. So it was quite a big chunk of the project. In reality, the simulation, you just hit simulate, and then you let it go for 8 hours and you let it simulate. Most of the work you're doing is actually just mesh refinement. So we get to the results. So as I mentioned, the numbers here don't mean too much, but the numbers did show that obviously there is more negative lift in the 2017 car. There also ended up being more drag as well. But as I said, these numbers don't really mean anything, to be honest. More so, we get onto the vortex flow pattern. So I've already gone into probably more detail than I wanted to on the mesh stuff, so I'm kind of conscious of how rambly and long this video is getting. So, flow pattern. So, the flow pattern of the 2016 cars where I looked at first, because it's nice to kind of go for the previous year to the next year. So, you can see the way I chose to display it was we have slices of where I was looking at. So, you have the entire simulation, and you basically think of it like a cake that you're kind of getting a knife to, and you cut it at a particular slice, and you kind of open it up and you're looking at that kind of slice. So that's what I'm doing here with the graphic. So I've shown what part I'm looking at. So here we're in the middle of the wing, here we're just after the wing, and then here we're basically at the kind of first quarter of the tire. So this is actually another point, interestingly enough, where other skills came in handy for me. Because I was able to use Photoshop quite proficiently, I was able to make this graphic in Photoshop. Like, these screenshots are from Star CCM, but the kind of annotations and like the slice points and just the way I've set it out is all done in Photoshop, and then I've imported it back into the Word file. So that came into a good handy when annotating it and everything like that, compared to just being able, instead of just kind of talking about each vortex, I was able to just go, right, Vortex A, Vortex B, Vortex C, Vortex D, and it was the easiest way possible to talk about everything. So you can see now, compared to the literature review, this vortex plot is a lot more complicated now. We've got not only just one kind of tip vortex and one main plane vortex, you've got two little tip vortexes here. You've got two other kind of inward vortexes, and then at the actual winglets, because we've got so many flaps, there's almost no main plane vortex almost that you can see until we get to behind the wing, where you can now see that's the kind of the main plane vortex. But ahead of that, when we're in the middle of the wing, there's just a lot of kind of interaction with the actual wing itself. So it's very, it doesn't look like a lot like the simple literature review stuff. But you can see very clearly the two tip vortexes very nicely spiral out. And as you go downstream, they get a little bit weaker. You can see a fifth vortex, Vortex E, comes into play, which is caused by this little upwards dip of the actual wing itself. So that's essentially the main plane vortex. And then you can see the actual tire itself, very faintly, you can see these kind of lighter blue areas. Hopefully it comes out in the video. I can't say for too sure in the video, but you've got these lighter blue areas where the vortex is eventually getting shed and now that's where the air is interacting with the tire. So a better way to illustrate it maybe for you guys for the video is using isosurfaces. So isosurface renders of the vorticity was very, very handy, because now you can clearly see it's like a animation almost of vortex A and vortex B. So if I go back to this, that's vortex A, that's vortex B, that is vortex A, that is vortex B, and you can now see surface renders clearly now show in a much better way what is happening here. So you can see coming off the end plate, you've got this smaller vortex spiraling, and then off the little end plate winglet here that we've got. So it's a little winglet that's on the edge of the end plate. You can see vortex A grows and spirals out here, and then here is this entire amount of turbulent air coming off the rotating tire. And so these two vortexes are going to help smoothen out the flow on the edge sidewall of the tire coming off. It's very turbulent, and these end plate vortexes are going to help smoothen out all that flow. We move to a different shot, and this is vortex C and D. So again, if I move back up, C and D is here. These are two kind of inward ones, and you can see them now on this isoform, and you can see very nicely how they wrap around the inside of the tire, and they go towards this little area of the side pod. So this was a big part of comparing 2016 to 2017, because you'll see a little bit later, 2017, the vortexes end up being so much more concrete and more uniform and neat to the inside. So it really did show how much of a benefit the 2017 Aero was going to be. Pressure plots over the geometry. So like we saw in the literature review, I did a pressure plot from the bird's eye view. And basically, you can see in this graphic again, I used screenshots from Star CCM, but then used Photoshop to really nicely demonstrate each of the kind of slices I was looking at. And so we're going from different slices of different heights. So this is like the lowest height. This is below the wing. Then we go to about halfway through the wing, and then we go to just above the wing where we're cutting the tire, basically. And as we go along those different slices, you can see the different points of the stagnation point of the tire, the point on top of the wing. You've got this high pressure, you've got this low pressure underneath the wing. You can see the difference here, just like we saw with the literature review. This was a very good point of confirming that my research is somewhat accurate, because it really went in the same pattern as literature review. You can see high pressure on this side of the end plate, and then lower pressure on the other side of the end plate, and so that kind of backs up with what we've seen in the literature review of why and how the air is going to move around over the end plate tip. But basically just going through this entire text explaining why you're seeing what we're seeing in these vortex diagrams, these vortex plots, basically just showing, okay, so at this point the pressure is doing this, so that's why this is happening. So the structure is basically 2016, the vortex, pressure for 2016 and 2017, then the 2017 vortex, and so that was the best way I thought it would set out, and in the end, clearly, my lecturers thought it was the best way to set it out as well. So this is 2017 now. You can see Vortex A is a lot stronger. There's now a larger red dot there. Vortex B is pretty much the same. Vortex C and D are so much stronger now. You can see so much more of a circular pattern on this vortex chart compared to 2016. You can see it's very kind of wishy-washy, very kind of warped. 2017 is so much more structured. And so now, and also you can see Vortex E. It's not very apparent on this slice here, but you can see Vortex E is there again. Now, Vortex E, it looks more prominent on 2016's one because it's more of a larger circle, but in reality, that actually is a less concentrated vortex, because it's a very large circle that's kind of spread out with this large pocket in between where there's no kind of strong vorticity, whereas this is a stronger vortex, and it's shown a lot more in the isoform render, where now you can see Vortex A and B, and you can see Vortex C. And so you now have got three different vortexes coming off the side of that end plate, helping smoothen out flow as we go downstream to the turbulent side of the tire. And again here, just kind of talking through that, using the pressure points, and then we get to comparing 2016 and 2017 very kind of directly now. We're not on separate pages. We're on 2016's here, 2017's here, and so this is a 3D volume generated vorticity plot. So it's effectively, if I go back to this, it's basically this, but rendered out in 3D, in a 3D space. So you can see, it's basically, it's a way to see this isoform, but you can also see the actual the magnitude of the vorticity in terms of the colors. And you can see here comparing, this is Vortex A essentially, and you can see 2017 to 2016, you can see here very faintly, but obviously the arrows hopefully are going to help you guys out to see that. You can see the vortex is extended so much further downstream in 2017 than it ever did in 2016. And the same thing can be said for Vortex B, and it's a lot more concentrated towards the end here, where it's starting to meet the sidewall of the tire compared to 2016. And then we've got the isoform on a heads-down display, and again, I use Photoshop to kind of color coordinate everything. So we've got the different vortexes, Vortex A in green, Vortex B in yellow, red is Vortex C/D, and then Vortex E is in orange. And so in 2016, you can't even see Vortex E. You can just about pick it out here in 2017, and you can clearly see Vortex C and D being so much more structured and more kind of uniform in 2017 than it is in 2016. It's been shed and warped a lot more, and that was a really great point for me to get out of the simulation, because obviously the regulations in 2017 did open up naturally for the teams to exploit the bargeboard area a lot more, so they would do that anyway, but it kind of backed up to the point of why they would do it and why you're seeing so much development in the bargeboard area, because now the vortex going towards that bargeboard area is so much more structured than it was in the previous year, that they can manipulate that air so much better because it's so much more structured. And in terms of looking at how the air would be affected with the wider tire, the argument here is because of the wider wing, essentially, and the more aggressive aero on the 2017 wings, although, yes, the tire is wider, the 2017 wing actually does a really fabulous job at getting a lot of the air around that tire and to this pinpoint place where the engineers want the air to go to help smoothen out the tire flow as they go towards the side pod. So that's pretty much all of that actual work, the actual main chunk of it. So hopefully that was somewhat interesting and understandable. I probably lost a lot of you at this point. As much as I want to say I'm trying my best to talk slow, I know I do talk naturally quite fast anyway. When I'm passionate about a topic, I just kind of can talk about it very, very fast. Definitely for sure, I'm not going to be a lecturer anytime soon. But so yeah, as I mentioned, a large part of the ending of the report and a lot of engineering reports in general, and that's definitely a tip for anyone in like lower years. For the third year report, make sure you have a decent amount to talk about future work, because they want you to give suggestions on what you would suggest other people to do in later years. So I, mentioned stuff like, you could look at the actual bargeboard area, because we can now see the vortex is a lot better towards that bargeboard area. So what's going to go on then? So do a simulation of downstream of the car then. And also I talk about the limitations of, I was using my PC at home. If I had used my university's high-powered computer, maybe I could have done more of the bargeboard area. Maybe I could have got more accurate data, because I maybe could have done an even more finer mesh, perhaps. And so the conclusions were basically summing up and giving the opinions on what is coming from this data, basically, what I think this all means. And as I mentioned, what I think it means, and what you can clearly see in the 2017 cars, is a much faster car, a much more aggressive car, a much better job at cleaning air up on the side of the tires, a lot more structured vortexes, which the engineers can now manipulate a lot more. So that's why we're seeing so much more aerodynamic updates on the cars around the bargeboard area to the side pod area, because the vortexes now coming downstream from the front wing are so much better now from the 2016 aero. And then, as usual, the bane of every student's existence, references. I actually didn't have too many. I had about 15 in total, because as I said, a lot of the literature review kind of show there wasn't actually too much previous research, so there was a lot of kind of linking back and referencing pretty much like one or two different major papers from like specific people, and then the appendix was just kind of giving out the specific mesh models, showcasing the refinement. These were the different control volumes for the meshing. So I've got a kind of base control volume, I've got a control volume over the wing, the wheel, to kind of fine-tune the mesh, and then, as I showed before, the wall Y plus. Prism layer thickness was important. I didn't mention that. Prism layer thickness was obviously something that's also quite important in the meshing phase. Getting that thickness is very crucial in terms of closer to the wall, how the simulation's gonna simulate that boundary layer flow. And then it was kind of cool to round out the appendix with the Ferrari car, and this was very minor, that's why it was in the appendix, but this was basically me showing off the difference in the 2016 to 2017 car, and basically going, you can clearly see why there's a lot more going on here, because the vortex going through here is a lot better than the one going through here. So that was a little kind of that was more for me. I didn't have to include this Appendix B, but as I kind of said, it was kind of cool for me to be able to actually use real world, very modern F1 examples in a university report, because from first year, I was really quite scared that I wasn't going to be able to passionately research and talk about F1 the way I wanted to throughout my degree, and finally in the third year report, I was able to. But yeah, that has been it. The recording's been over an hour. I don't know how long it's going to be when I cut down the video. I did mention at the very start it was going to be a very rambly video, so I think there's going to be like 5 people at this point still watching. But nonetheless, to those 5 people, if you did enjoy watching it, do leave a like. Let me know what you thought. And as I said, if you're a fellow engineering student and you have any questions, then let me know in the comments below. If you're an A-level and GCSE, hopefully this was a good kind of showcase it, maybe what you could get up to in a third year project, or if you're an F1 fan and what you can get up to in a third year project. And I don't know, yeah, as I said, I don't really know what I was setting out to do with this video. Hopefully it just kind of showed you a very, very different side to what my life was like over the last 3 years compared to the videos I was uploading. But yeah, that's been a little chat about my university third year project. I apologize if I've made you go to sleep. I imagine by 10 minutes in, people were sleeping on the video, but there you go. That's engineering, to be honest. In my opinion, I can't lie, a lot of it's not very exciting to me. As I mentioned, my project was pretty much the most fun I've had doing the degree. There was countless lectures where it was like, I am piss bored here. And I guess that's a big reason why I've kind of fallen out of the thought with actually using my degree to go into engineering, because at the moment I'm really, really enjoying YouTube. I'm enjoying the media side of F1 a lot more. And for me now, it's kind of a case of, okay, I've got this really, really solid degree. Maybe I'll use it in the future, or maybe I'll go back even when YouTube slows down. Maybe I go back and do a master's. Maybe I go back and do a brand new degree and change my degree path or something like that. Or I don't know. I'm still glad I did the degree because going into A-level, I did maths, physics, and art. So I've always been comfortable with maths. It's always been that subject where it's kind of been like, okay, it's where I'm meant to be. You know, I'm good. I'm comfortable with numbers. I don't really like any of the wishy-washy kind of other subjects. I kind of like the fact that maths is kind of, it's correct or it's incorrect most of the time. So there was kind of no other degree I thought I would ever end up doing. And I'm glad I finished it and I did it, because it's a very, very nice degree to have in handy, because I could have technically maybe just walked into some kind of boring banking job in London, or I don't know, I could have just gone for an engineering job, but that's all very boring, isn't it? So I'd rather kind of do what I'm passionate about, which at the moment is being YouTube. But I'm glad I did it in the end, because I had a really good time with it, good experience, and obviously meeting university friends and everything like that is also an added bonus. So yeah, that's been this video, guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll let you pop off to continue that slumber that you probably did about halfway through the video. But yeah, hope you guys did enjoy it in the end, though, nonetheless. And I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.